My name is Luke. My girlfriend Catherine and I met 3 years ago as freshmen in college. We go to Stanford, which has been my dream school since I was 8. Neither of us are from California, far from it actually. We're both from Ohio, her from Cincinnati, and me from just outside Columbus. I think that's a big reason we were drawn to each other. One of our holiday traditions is splitting Christmas between our families. Since her house is just a 2-hour drive from mine, we spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrates at night, and then drive through the night to her house for Christmas Day. Oddly enough, my favorite part isn't Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. It's the late night drive. It's our own little tradition, something we both look forward to every year. The route from my house to hers doesn't take us on a major highway. It's mostly quiet back roads, just fields, trees, and the occasional farmhouse. It's always really late at night when we do it, and we rarely encounter other cars. It feels like the world is asleep and we have it all to ourselves. We always blast Juice WRLD during the drive. His music has been a shared obsession since we met. There's something special about singing the lyrics together, like we're in sync. This past Christmas Eve started like any other. After a night with my extended family, we packed up my car around midnight and hit the road. The snow was falling lightly and the roads were deserted. Everything felt perfect. Then my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I ignored it without thinking. Probably just a scam call. Catherine made a joke about how committed those telemarketers must be to call on Christmas, and we laughed about it. But then, a few minutes later, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. I sighed, letting it go to voicemail. Catherine glanced at me with a confused look, but didn't say anything. 2 minutes later, my phone rang a third time. I was pissed. I grabbed my phone aggressively, ready to tell whoever it was to screw off. I startled Catherine with how quickly I reacted, but when I answered, I was met with silence. Then static. I was about to hang up when a man's voice spoke. "Hello, Luke." I nearly swerved off the road. I couldn't speak. Before I could respond, the man continued. He started reciting personal information. My full name, my address, details about my life that no stranger should know. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to pull over, but I kept driving, feeling like I was in some kind of trance. After a pause, I finally found my voice. I asked him what he wanted, trying to keep my tone steady despite the fear creeping into my chest. He paused before saying something that made my blood run cold. "I'm not here for you, I'm here for Catherine." Hearing her name was 10 times more terrifying than hearing my own. I glanced at Catherine. The horrified expression on her face told me she was just as shocked as I was. I blurted out that he had the wrong number, that I didn't know a Catherine. The man chuckled. "She's sitting right next to you." That was it for me. I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking. I was about to demand answers when Catherine reached over and, in one fluid motion, hung up the phone. I stared at her, furious. Why would she do that? A stranger had just made personal threats toward us, and she cut off the only source of information we had. She didn't answer me, just looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. I tried calling the number back, once, twice, 3 times. Each time, it never went through. Catherine told me to keep driving, which I did, but not before questioning her. She insisted she was scared and just reacted. I wanted to believe her, but something in the pit of my stomach felt off. Catherine and I have had a solid relationship, but there have been small things. White lies, half-truths, moments where I caught her being less than honest. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't play music again, and neither of us spoke. My mind was spinning with a million unanswered questions. Who was that man? How did he know so much about me, about us? Only our families knew we were driving that night, and I knew for a fact that none of them would ever pull something like this. That left only one explanation: someone else knew. When we finally pulled into Catherine's driveway, I still felt unsettled. It's been almost a month since this happened, and I still don't have answers. Neither of our family members were responsible. We asked all of them. Catherine swears she's just as clueless as I am. That leaves only one possibility. The person on the other end of the phone had sinister intentions. Maybe you think I'm overreacting to a prank call, but I'm telling you, other than our families, No one on earth knew we'd be driving that night. I can't shake the feeling that he's going to call again. It's just a matter of time. Every time my phone rings now, I hesitate before answering, dreading the possibility of hearing that voice again. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I do know one thing. This isn't over. Last fall, I set out on a solo backpacking trip through a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. Hiking alone wasn't new to me. I actually preferred it. There was something peaceful about being completely isolated in nature, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The plan was simple. I'd park my car at a small ranger station, hike 3 days in, then turn around and hike back. I had all the essentials, plenty of food, a sturdy tent, and my rifle, just in case. The first day was uneventful, aside from spotting a few deer and the occasional black bear far in the distance. It was on the second night that things took a turn. I set up camp just off the trail, making sure to keep my fire small to avoid drawing attention. As I lay in my tent that night, I had an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. At first, I chalked it up to the usual nerves of being alone in the woods, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping nearby. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't just the random creak of the forest settling, it was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone or something was walking toward my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The forest was still, eerily so, and I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back inside, forcing myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and instantly felt my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite, human footprints. They circled my tent in tight loops over and over again. I tried to stay calm. Maybe another hiker had passed through and got curious, but that didn't explain why they hadn't spoken to me or why they had spent so much time lurking just feet away from where I slept. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before, deciding to cut my trip short and head back to my car. The whole way I felt on edge, like I was being watched. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. By the time I made camp that night, I was utterly exhausted. I debated pushing through without stopping, but knew I wouldn't make it without rest. So, reluctantly, I set up my tent in a small clearing, making sure to keep my rifle within arm's reach. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. My entire body tensed. The voices were low, barely audible, but they were definitely there, just beyond my campsite. I strained to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too quiet. Slowly, I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, suddenly, silence. Not the natural silence of the forest, but something deeper, more unnatural. No wind, no insects, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my rifle, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. At dawn, I unzipped my tent and immediately noticed something was wrong. My boots, which I had left outside the tent flap, were missing. So was my backpack. Panic set in as I scanned the area, my mind racing. Then, about 10 feet away, I saw them. My boots, neatly placed side by side, with my backpack propped upright against a tree. And right next to them, carved deep into the bark, were the words, "Don't come back." I didn't waste a second. I threw on my boots, grabbed my gear, and bolted down the trail, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. Every rustling leaf, every shadow sent waves of fear through me. I had never run so fast in my life. When I finally reached my car, I practically collapsed inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, peeling out of that parking lot as fast as I could. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know how long they had been following me or why they chose not to harm me. But one thing is for sure, I won't be going back to that trail. Ever. I used to work as a surveyor, traveling deep into forests and mountains to map out areas for future development. It was a job that required long hours, often in complete isolation. While I loved the quiet, I quickly learned that being alone in the wilderness sometimes meant being at the mercy of things you couldn't explain. One particular job still haunts me to this day. It was a remote location, deep in the Rockies. Far from any towns or well-traveled roads, I was assigned to map a dense stretch of forest that hadn't seen human activity in decades. There was no cell service, no radio signal, and no nearby ranger stations. Just miles of trees, steep ridges, and the occasional stream cutting through the wilderness. I was given 2 weeks to complete the job, but after the first few days, I knew something was off. At first, it was small things. My gear being slightly rearranged when I woke up, my food supply seeming lighter than I remembered. I thought maybe I was just exhausted and misremembering things, so I brushed it off. But then, the noises started. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would hear footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate, and never close enough for me to see who or what was making them. The first night, I chalked it up to wildlife, maybe a bear or a curious deer. But by the third night, I realized something chilling. The footsteps were always two-legged. I stayed locked in my tent, gripping my knife, heart pounding as the steps moved in a slow, steady circle around my camp. They would stop suddenly, then start again minutes later. The worst part was that whoever, or whatever, was out there never made a sound beyond their footsteps. No breathing, no rustling, nothing. On the fourth night, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. As soon as I heard the steps, I burst out of my tent, flashlight in one hand, my rifle in the other. Nothing, just darkness and the endless stretch of trees. That's when I saw it. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. Large, barefoot, and scattered as if someone had been standing still and shifting their weight side to side. A horrible feeling settled in my stomach as I slowly backed into my tent, locking the zipper shut. The next morning, I packed my things and moved my camp miles away. I didn't care if it delayed my work. I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. But it didn't matter. That night, the footsteps returned. Only this time, there was more than one set. I barely slept. I kept my rifle at my side, my ears straining for any sign of movement beyond the footsteps. Then just before dawn, something new happened. The footsteps stopped, and then for the first time, I heard a voice. It was low and garbled, like someone was trying to speak but didn't know how. The sound made my skin crawl. I forced myself to stay silent, barely breathing as the voice mumbled nonsense, growing closer to my tent. I've never felt fear like that before. Then, suddenly, my tent shook violently, as if something had grabbed it from the outside. I scrambled for my rifle, ready to fire, when everything just stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, in the distance, I heard something crashing through the forest, running away at an impossible speed. When daylight broke, I packed up and left. I didn't care about finishing the job. I just wanted out. On my hike back to my truck, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low tree branch was my missing surveyor's compass, swinging slowly as if someone had just placed it there. I never told my employer the real reason I left. I just said the site was inaccessible and refused to return. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me, and I don't ever want to find out.